Hey everyone, I'm Liz Perry, and today I'm going to show you how I made these super cute Mario-inspired mini mushroom charms. These are super cute and quick to make, and it's a great use for scrap yarn. A while back, I made these larger amigurumi mushrooms, so if you're looking for something a bit bigger, check that tutorial out. To make these tiny mushrooms, you'll need a crochet hook, a pair of scissors, bobby pins or stitch markers, a yarn needle, and I'll be using a sewing needle to sew my finished charms onto some clasps, or you could sew some earring hardware onto your charms, or just a metal jump ring, a necklace, a keychain. There's so many ways that you can use these little charms. Finally, you'll need yarn. I used red for the cap, white for the spots, and off-white for the stem. I was originally going to use black yarn for the eyes, but I ended up just using regular black sewing thread instead for this. You can still use the yarn if you want. For the other mushroom designs, I switched out the red for light green and purple. And if you like, you can find the written pattern for these charms in my Ravelry store. The link to that will be in the description below. You may notice that this is all worsted weight yarn. To create these charms, you'll actually need to use crochet thread weight yarn instead. I kind of prefer to use the worsted weight yarn though, because the color variety you can find with worsted weight yarn is just, well, you can't really compare it to crochet thread. Plus, I just think I prefer the look and feel of the worsted weight yarn. So I use this trick to make crochet thread weight yarn out of worsted weight yarn. First, I'll cut a strand from my scrap, because it's easier to do this with a really small amount of yarn, and this project won't really use that much yarn anyway. Now I'll take that yarn from the middle, and untwist the yarn until I can see the 4 individual threads that make up the yarn. So next I'll take 2 of those individual strands, and I'll begin to pull apart the yarn, being very careful not to twist the 2 halves together or to tangle anything up. Every once in a while, I'll smooth out the end of the yarn to keep it from getting twisted or tangled. Then, once I've pulled apart the yarn all the way to the end, I'll pull each end gently to smooth it out and get some of the twists out. Then I'll do the same thing to the other side of the yarn and untwist it from the center to the end. I'll do this for each color that I need for the project. Or if you want to make your life easier, skip this step and just use crochet thread, or you could also use embroidery floss. Now I can make this cap using my red yarn. Or if you want to make one of the other mushroom designs, just swap out the color for whatever mushroom you want to make. First, I'll create a double magic circle with 6 stitches of single crochet. I'm using a double magic circle for this project because that's what I prefer. This is a little more of an advanced technique, and you could really use any method, like a chain 3 and slip stitch, or a single magic circle. Since I'm going to cover this up later when we make the spot on the top of the mushroom cap, you won't actually see this part, so it doesn't necessarily need to have the clean finish that a double magic circle gives. So if you'd like a more detailed explanation on any of those methods, you can check out my Beginner's Crochet Lessons series. Bear in mind though, that if you're making the purple design without the spots, the top of the mushroom cap will be visible, so you may want to try to use a magic circle method for that one. Now I have a circle of 6 stitches to begin my work. Next, to make the mushroom cap wider, I'll increase every stitch of the row. To increase, I'm going to single crochet 2 times in each stitch. For this mushroom, I'm just going to increase for 1 row, but if you want to make a larger mushroom, you can check out my Beginner's Crochet Lessons series again for my video on increasing in the round, so that you can add more rows of increase. At the end of this row, I have a total of 12 stitches. Next, I'll single crochet for 2 rows to lengthen the cap before I end it. Alright, I've finished with 2 rows of single crochet. Next, I'll end the cap with a slip stitch to the first stitch of the row. Then I'll cut off the yarn and sew in the ends. And just a side note here, for the green mushroom, for some reason the yarn seems to be a tiny bit smaller than the other colors that I used for this project. To make up for this, I ended up adding an extra row of single crochet before ending the green cap. If your yarn or thread or embroidery floss creates a cap that you feel is too small, you can always do the same thing. The next part we have to make is the stem. I'm using an off-white yarn for this part. First, I'll create another magic circle, just like I did when I was making the cap, only this time, I'll start with 8 stitches of single crochet instead of 6. This is because I want to make the stem a little wider, but not so wide that I need to make another row to widen it. It's just easier to create the first row with 8 stitches so that we don't have to increase like we were when we were making the cap, and we can make sure the project stays little and cute. Next, I'm going to single crochet for 4 rows to elongate the stem, because I want to have just enough length that there's a little bit of stem poking out of the bottom of the cap to make the little face. At the end of 4 rows, I'll slip stitch to the first stitch of the row to end the row. Then I'll cut off the yarn, leaving a long tail, which I'll use to sew the stem to the underside of the cap later. Then I'll add fiber fill to the inside of the stem so that my stem stays plush. Now using my white yarn, I'll create 5 spots on the red cap. 1 on top, 1 on the front, 1 on the back, and 1 on each side. First, I'll mark roughly where I want to place each spot with a line, then I'll fill in each spot with more lines. Try to make all the spots about the same size and the same shape. Once I've filled in all the spots, I'll create small stitches all the way around to outline each spot. If you're making the purple mushroom with the skull on the front, I'll show you how I created that look at the end of this video. Next, I need to use the tail of the stem to sew the stem to the underside of the cap. To do this, I'm just going to sew the top of the stem to the inside of the cap, and when I bring the needle out through the top of the cap, I'll make sure to put my needle back through in the same place, going through the fabric of the cap, back through to the stem, so that you don't see the stitches on the outside of the mushroom. I did this all the way around the top of the stem. And finally, I'm going to use some black thread to embroider the eyes onto the charm. This is a little trickier to get right than you would think, and I redid them several times to make them look right. At first I tried making the eyes with more of my crochet thread made from scraps of my worsted weight yarn. This kind of worked, but it was just really hard to get the shape of the eye right without becoming too bulky, so in the end I switched to regular sewing thread and a sewing needle to place the eyes. I'm also doubling my thread to make this process a little faster.
Want to grow? The calcium in milk helps bones grow. Okie dokie.
So after fastening my thread, I brought the needle out where I want the first eye to end, pretty low on the face. Then I'll stitch through the inside of the face, from the top of where I want to place this eye, about a third of the way down the face, then across to where I want the other eye to begin, again about a third of the way down the face. I'm placing my eyes fairly close together, with only a little more than a stitch in between, maybe about a stitch and a half. Then I inserted the needle into the spot where I want the other eye to end, again fairly close to the bottom of the face. And I brought it back out again at the bottom of the other side, in the same spot where I started. Now that I've marked each eye, I'm going to shape them into a long oval. I placed more stitches on each side of the first one, by stitching in the exact same place, and pulling the needle through slowly and sort of laying the thread to one side of the first stitch. Then I did the same thing on the other side of the first stitch. I repeated this process until I liked the size of the eye. Then I did the same thing with the other eye. Then I'll fasten the end and cut off the thread. And now this little red mushroom is done. Next, I'll add the clasp, to turn this little mini amigurumi into a charm. To sew on my clasps, I'll be using a normal sewing needle and my crochet thread, so that the thread matches the spot on the top of my mushroom. It's a little tricky to thread this yarn onto the needle, because this needle isn't really meant for sewing yarn, but unfortunately none of my yarn needles could fit through the hole in the clasps that I have, so I'm just going to have to thread the yarn onto the needle by twisting the end really tight and pushing it through until there's enough yarn popping out of the needle's eye that I can just pull it through the rest of the way. I tried doing this with a needle threader at first to experiment, but I actually ended up just breaking the only two needle threaders that I had, trying to get the thread through, so I found that just twisting the thread really tightly actually worked better. If you want to make your life easier, just use some matching regular sewing thread for this part. After fastening my thread, I brought it out pretty much at the center of the top middle spot of the cap. Then I placed the needle through the hole in the clasp and sewed it down to the top spot, making sure that the clasp is facing forward in the same direction as the eyes. I just stitched through the clasp 2 times, because that's as many times as I could fit my needle and crochet thread through the clasp. And finally, I fastened my thread. And now this little red mushroom charm is done. But wait, we still have to finish our other mushroom design. To create the purple mushroom, I repeated the same steps to make the cap, this time using purple yarn. Then, using my white yarn, I embroidered a tiny skull on the front. First, I fastened the yarn inside the cap. I started with a sort of long, thin C shape, facing the bottom of the mushroom. Sort of like a C that's fallen over onto its face. Then I'll divide that line in half with another stitch, going towards the bottom, kind of turning the C into an E, but a curved E. Now I'll connect the bottom of the 3 lines of my E with a straight line across the bottom. The empty space in between my stitches will now be the eyes of my little skull. Next I'm going to create the teeth. I'll start with 2 small vertical lines that are placed directly below each eye. Next, I'll place more vertical lines of stitching in between, to kind of fill in that space, but I'm going to leave a little purple dot in the middle empty to create the nose. Now we have a tiny embroidered skull. Next, I'll just finish up this mushroom with a stem, sew on the clasp, this time using my purple yarn, and finally I'll add some little eyes. A lot of the time, the purple mushrooms in the Mario games tend to have angry little lines on the eyes, so I'll just add some stitches angled over the inner corner of the top of the eye to make little angry eyebrows. I added all my little Mario mushroom charms to a charm bracelet, or you could also add the charms to a pair of earring hooks, or just sew the charms straight onto the earring hook. And now all my little mushrooms are finished. If you're interested in the written pattern, you can find a link to my pattern store on Ravelry, where you can find all of my designs in the description below. I wasn't sure I'd be able to recreate these mushrooms on such a small scale, but I'm so pleasantly surprised at how well they came out. I also made some prototypes of more Mario-inspired charms to go with these mushrooms. Which design do you like best? Which charm tutorial should I make next? Let me know in the comments. And as always, if you use this technique to make a mushroom charm of your own, I'd love to see your interpretation. You can find all of my social media links in the description below. If you enjoyed this tutorial, you could press the like button or share it on social media, and if you'd really like to help out the channel, you can donate to my Patreon. You can get some pretty cool perks through Patreon, like seeing my videos early, access to some of my prototype patterns, and discounts in my Ravelry store, depending on your level of donation. You can find out more about that at patreon.com/fairyrings. You could also subscribe and click the bell icon so that you don't miss my next video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!